All right. Thank you both Jen Turner and Kim Barben for joining us today. Thank you for everybody viewing this, either online, streaming, or seeing the recording of this. My name is Ryan Serrano Hall. I'm the education manager here at Eastern State Penitentiary, and we have a great program for you today. This is part of our Teacher Institute that we hold here at Eastern State Penitentiary, where it is essentially 11 teachers in each cohort, and they do a teachback. This teachback is going to consist of some of the material we went over in the cohort, and more or less it's criminal justice adjacent. So more details about that in a little bit. I'm going to turn this talk over for the sake of time to a very, very awesome person and a friend that I consider a friend, Jennifer Turner from the ACLU. Let me see your co-host. All right. She's going to, I believe, what are you talking about today, Jen? Prison labor again,
Mhm.
right? Awesome. The floor
Yeah,
is yours.
great. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to share my screen and share a PowerPoint, and I will ask for you to let me know if I don't do this right, because I often don't. So I'm going to share my screen and screen one, share, and let me try to play.
Working.
That worked. Okay, great. And now let me try to actually play this. Get my point. Hold on a second. Actually, I'm going to stop for a second because I'm going to play my PowerPoint. Sorry, y'all. Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay, I'm going to try that again. Sorry. This always gets me. Okay. Share.
It makes me feel better, Jen. Somebody that's intelligent and with your prestige, if you're having issues with Zoom, we all are. So we're in a good boat.
Can you see okay?
Yes, looks great.
Great. That's great. I can't see the comments while I'm talking. I'm not sure why I can't, but that's just my own failure. Sorry, my camera's on the side. So anyway, thanks so much for having me. I really am so grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you and about prison labor. I'm a human rights researcher at the ACLU. I'm a lawyer and researcher who documents human rights violations in the ACLU. And I was the primary researcher and author of a report called Captive Labor on human rights abuses in the exploitation of incarcerated workers. And we published this report, Captive Labor, which you can access online, aclu.org/captive labor. And I wanted to talk with you today to talk a bit about the history of prison labor, especially if you're interested in the history, if you teach and educate about the history, maybe of interest. And then we'll talk about our findings about prison labor today, and then talk at the end about ways to take action and current changes in state and federal laws and advocacy on this issue. But the roots of our prison labor programs are in the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime, which opened up the use of incarcerated workers, exploitation of incarcerated workers, and led to early prison labor programs, which are convict leasing, where incarcerated people, both in the North and the South, faced brutal working conditions and were forced to work up to 17 hours a day, building factories, laying railroads, producing goods, mining coal. And in the North, about 3/4 of people who were incarcerated were working in industrial factories. And in the South, people worked on plantations and coal mines, turpentine farms. And these were incarcerated workers who were working for private employers who had unfettered control over these workers and subjected them to brutal punishments. And in Mississippi, for example, not a single leased convict lived long enough to even serve a 10-year sentence. Moving on. Because this was so lucrative for the government, that it led to encourage the criminalization and effective re-enslavement of Black people during the Jim Crow era, and the passage of Black codes, which criminalized just existence as a Black man, and led to further incarceration. And we really see this impacts of the systemic racism today. The convict leasing system kind of segued into a state use system where the state became the only lawful purchaser of incarcerated labor and goods. This was because of the concern about ensuring that there wasn't competition with free labor. And this led to incarcerated workers being employed directly by the state around the country, including the use of chain gangs, which started in Georgia and spread throughout the South as states began to phase out the convict leasing system. And by 1923, every state except Rhode Island used chain gangs. These prison work programs expanded as the prison system expanded. And I came into this research in part because I traveled to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, commonly known as Angola Prison in Louisiana, to research life without parole sentences for nonviolent offenses. And when I was there, you see this photo here, I saw predominantly almost entirely Black men working in the fields, overseen by a white corrections officer on horseback, armed with a shotgun. And it was clearly just a vision of slavery on the site of a former slave plantation. And at the time, the warden was very proud of their prison labor programs. They were farming tilapia. We ate food in the sheriff's house. In the warden's house that was produced by incarcerated workers. And I started to wonder more about the conditions of work of incarcerated workers, how many people are engaged in work while they're incarcerated, and conditions, pay, all of these questions hadn't really been covered in any kind of in-depth investigation. But these penal plantations today are really a manifestation of this history of chattel slavery and the what followed after the 13th Amendment. And today now, incarcerated workers are doing agricultural work on prison farms in states throughout the South, which have their direct roots in this chattel slavery system. And some of these are situated on the land of sites of slave plantations. And today, incarcerated workers are even producing some of the same crops that were grown by enslaved people on the same land. Here's just a picture of a North Carolina prison on the site of a former slave plantation. And one incarcerated worker at Angola prison said one of the deputies there told him the reason they named this Angola is because that's where slaves escaped from the motherland, and that it'll never happen again because it's legal now. This led to our investigation, and it was a 2-year, actually more than 2 years study, partly because of the pandemic, into the conditions of work of incarcerated workers. I filed FOIA requests in every state in the federal prison system, conducted a survey of incarcerated workers, as well as analyzing Bureau of Justice Statistics surveys, and found that 65% of people in prisons work. That's nearly 800,000 incarcerated workers in prisons. And this doesn't include people incarcerated in jails and in ICE detention facilities because it was too difficult to get data on those workers. So we have more than 800,000 people working while incarcerated in this country. And they do much of the same work that people do outside of prisons, but there are 3 crucial distinct differences. They're under the complete control of their employers. Their employer is their jailer. They're forced to work. They have no right to refuse to work or to choose the type of work that they do. And they're stripped of the most minimal protections against labor exploitation and abuse. The key findings we had were that they're forced to work. They're paid very low wages, pennies per hour. We found data on the types of work and numbers of workers. We discussed who benefits from prison labor, documented dangerous conditions and preventable injuries, and the fact that these prison work programs generally, by and large, don't actually provide vocational training or useful skills development. I'm going to talk about each of these components of the report, and let me know if I'm going too long. So, one of our main findings, people are forced to work. Both the 13th Amendment and the constitutions of 16 states, actually I think it's 13 now, I'm sorry, I have to update that, prohibit slavery and forced labor except as punishment for a crime. So many states have the same language adopted from the 13th Amendment. And prison labor is compulsory in the federal prison system and in many states. So people who are incarcerated are required to work. More than 3/4 of incarcerated workers report that they are required to work, that work is compulsory. And many workers report that even being sick or injured, having a disability or a physical inability to work doesn't relieve them of their work duties. mean, to the point where even an incarcerated worker who had recently had a leg amputated was forced to reply to her work assignment. And if incarcerated people are unwilling or unable to perform the work assigned to them, they face very severe punishments, such as solitary confinement, the denial of opportunities to reduce their sentence, good time credits, which means that their time served is effectively longer. They're punished with more time served. They are denied family visitation, ability to call home, and access to commissary to buy necessities. And so, an instance in federal prisons, a single instance of refusal or inability to work can add a month back into your sentence. It can result in 60 days of solitary confinement in Florida and a reduction of 90 days towards their sentence. And it can extend substantially beyond that. I talked to people who spent literally years in solitary confinement because of refusal or inability to work. And here you see a quote, and this is something I heard repeatedly, is that, as he said, one incarcerated worker in Louisiana said most of the time he spent in solitary was from refusing to be a slave, refusing to work in fields of corn. I talked to an incarcerated worker in Arkansas who refused to work picking cotton. That was the one job he refused to do. As a Black man, it was the site of a former slave plantation, and that was the one work that he just simply refused to do, and spent all of cotton season every year, 4 months in solitary confinement. He was willing to do any other job, but that was the job assigned to him. We also found workers are paid in pennies. 7 states pay nothing for virtually all work assignments. And overall, workers are paid between 13 and 52 cents per hour. But the vast majority of workers, and I'll talk about this in a sec, are doing maintenance work when they're paid at the very lowest ends of the pay scales. And these wages remain stagnant for decades. You can see here, workers in Vermont have earned 25 cents an hour since 1988. Also, despite only earning pennies per hour, these wages are garnished where prison systems, departments of corrections, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons deduct as much as 80% from their paychecks to cover court-imposed fines, restitution, child support, and even room and board fees. So workers see very, very little of this very paltry wages that they earn. And this has tremendous impact on both themselves, but their families, because workers' wages are so low. Their families who are already struggling from the loss of income when their loved one is incarcerated have to step in to support their loved one. And data shows that families with an incarcerated loved one spend an estimated $2.9 billion a year on commissary accounts and phone calls. And over half of these families are forced to go into debt to afford these costs. And this is partly because their loved one is unable to earn a decent wage while incarcerated. Here you see a photo of incarcerated women working at a laundry facility. We conducted a survey of incarcerated workers, and as I mentioned, analyzed the Bureau of Justice Statistics data and found that 70% of incarcerated workers said they could not afford basic necessities with their prison wages. 64% are concerned about their safety while working. 70% they received no training at all, no job training, and 76%, as mentioned, were forced to work. The types of jobs that incarcerated workers are engaged in, more than 80%, at least 80%, are doing maintenance work. This is janitorial work, food preparation, grounds maintenance, within the prison. This is maintenance work to maintain the prisons that confine them. About 8% are doing public works assignments. These are assignments, job assignments working for state, municipal, and local governments on jobs outside of the prisons. 6.5% are working for state-owned prison industries, which I'll talk about in a minute, but every state but Alaska has a state-owned prison industry program. 2% are in work release programs. About 2% are working in agriculture, which covers several of these categories. And only 0.6% are working directly employed by private companies through the prison, through a private industry program, which I'll talk about as well. Let me just check the time, sorry. Who benefits from prison labor? We do. The prison system does, and state and local governments do. Incarcerated workers employed, those 6.5% who are working for state prison industries programs, generate more than $2 billion in goods and services in value for state prison programs. And the value of the maintenance work is very difficult to estimate. One economist very conservatively estimated the value is $9 billion a year. This is annually. So despite generating so much value, these workers are paid very little. And really, incarcerated workers' labor, many people, I think, falsely believe that this is largely benefits private companies, but the fact is that more than 80% are working in maintenance work, and it really offsets or partially offsets the staggering costs of our bloated prison system. The prison labor really masks the true costs of mass incarceration. State governments spend nearly $50 billion a year to keep over 1 million people in prisons. This is less than our total corrections cost, which is more than $81 billion per year. And yet, less than 1% of state corrections budgets goes to the wages of incarcerated workers, while 68% of state prison expenditures is spent on wages and benefits for the public sector staff who operate prisons and jails. So to give you a sense of how much money is, I wouldn't say but saved, but is it offset by using and forcing workers to maintain these state prisons, and really prevents us from really confronting the costs, both the human costs, but also the economic costs of mass incarceration. Who benefits? Also state, local, and federal governments. These public works projects and programs really state and local governments rely on unpaid and low paid incarcerated workers. As I mentioned, about 8% of incarcerated workers are engaged in this work. And through these programs, state and local governments, municipal governments, county governments, agencies can contract with state departments of corrections or the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and jails do this as well, to employ incarcerated workers who are paid very little, if at all, to do all kinds of essential public work, maintaining cemeteries and school grounds, fairgrounds, public parks. They do road work. Many are employed by the departments of transportation doing road work. They construct buildings. They clean government offices. They clean up landfills and hazardous spills. They engage in forestry work. They treat sewage. And the Florida Department of Corrections, for instance, they employ 3,500 incarcerated workers who are paid nothing at all to work on state road crews. And the value of this is nearly $150 million over a 5-year period. And state and local governments will engage or employ incarcerated workers to do all kinds of work that is incredibly dangerous and hazardous, including asbestos abatement, toxic cleanup, culling birds that are sick with avian flu. So the New York Department of Corrections drew in over $7.5 million selling abatement services since 2017. That's between 2017 and 2022, where incarcerated workers were employed cleaning lead paint and mold and bird feces for state agencies and local governments. They also rely on incarcerated workers as a low wage or unpaid labor force to respond to natural disasters and emergencies. And this is something that really we've seen in the media with the wildfires in California. This is covered pretty extensively, the role of incarcerated workers on the front lines in wildfire response as firefighters. California is not the only state to do this. It's at least one of at least 14 states that employs incarcerated workers as firefighters fighting wildfires. At least 30 states explicitly include incarcerated workers as a labor resource in their state level emergency operations plans. With respect to firefighters in Georgia, nearly 1/3 of counties rely on incarcerated firefighters, all of whom are unpaid. And in some communities, incarcerated firefighters are the only fire protection emergency medical response units. State and local governments and federal governments also benefit financially through incarcerated workers' work in state prison industries. I mentioned before, about 6.5% of incarcerated workers are employed in these federal prison industries programs. They're state-owned corporations that produce goods, services, and commodities that are sold to other government agencies and sometimes to private companies as well. And most states use their state prison industries programs to produce their license plates, for instance, but it's much broader than that. Many states actually require all of their state agencies and public institutions, that includes public universities and schools, to purchase manufactured goods, including furniture and cleaning supplies, printed materials, and uniforms from their state correctional industries. So state incarcerated people employed in federal and state correctional industries programs also manufacture the uniforms worn by police and other government officials, for instance, or use the letterhead. If a new governor comes in, the letterhead's often from a state prison industries program. But they also, incarcerated workers also provide services, jobs, repairing state-owned vehicles, data entry, washing laundry. If you call your DMV, often it's an incarcerated worker who's answering the phone, for instance, through this program. As I mentioned here, I wrote here that at least 37 states use incarcerated worker. All of the license plates in the state are produced by incarcerated workers in a prison industries program. And prison industries programs are more recently, in more recent years, some have been turned to very lucrative labor contracts that allow private companies to directly employ incarcerated workers who are paid very little, paid a little bit more than some of the other jobs available. Arizona is one example, Colorado as well, where incarcerated workers are working directly for private companies, where the Department of Corrections, their prison industries program, has a labor contract where the company pays a certain amount per hour. The prison industries program pockets a big chunk of that, and incarcerated workers are paid a small fraction, and they're working directly for private companies. And so the way these industries programs have circumvented rules that are meant to apply to protect incarcerated workers who are directly employed by private companies that engage in any kind of interstate commerce, and they're kind of getting around these rules with this. The state and local governments, here's the net sales for these correctional industries programs. You can see, we were talking millions of dollars for each of these states in terms of the value of the goods and services and commodities, and adds up to over $2 billion per year of this fairly small percentage of incarcerated workers. The private sector benefits as well, but it's not to the extent I think that many assume. When I undertook this research, I think the biggest surprise was how much our state and local governments rely on incarcerated workers. It was also the incredibly large percentage of workers who are simply doing maintenance work, and it was how few private companies really benefit. But there are ways that they benefit, and there are ways that goods and products produced by incarcerated workers ends up in consumers' hands. And while work directly through, it's called the PICP program, where incarcerated workers are employed directly by companies, private companies that are engaged in interstate commerce, it's less than 1% of work assignments. But private companies do employ workers through these prison industries programs. They also buy goods and services produced by incarcerated workers. So actually we found, for instance, meat and milk that we consume has been produced by incarcerated workers and ends up into our, in our grocery stores, and we are unaware that, say, the salad that we're buying or the meat was actually produced through incarcerated labor. And private companies do benefit substantially and profit from incarcerated people's need to provide for their basic needs like food, health, communications, but they're not the primary beneficiaries of prison labor. But I list here a few examples of more than $10.5 million worth of milk was sold by Colorado and South Carolina prison industry programs, so Dairy Farmers of America. And this is where milk ends up in the milk we buy, but it's impossible to follow the chain to know that when you're purchasing something at the supermarket. Here, I'll try to go through a little quicker. The other thing we found was that incarcerated workers are excluded from all standard workplace protections that apply to every other worker virtually in the country. But they're explicitly excluded, or courts have ruled that they're excluded from federal statutes like our Fair Labor Standards Act, which is our minimum wage and overtime law, our Civil Rights Act, the National Labor Relations Act. These provide for minimum wage, protection from discrimination, and the right to collectively bargain, to unionize. And OSHA, the main federal statute that just sets minimum standards and safeguards for health and safety in the workplace, excludes almost all incarcerated workers, most of them, and many state statutes do as well, which means that incarcerated workers are doing work that is often dangerous and hazardous, but without any of the protections and oversight that would happen outside of prisons, or if they were not incarcerated. So they may be working outside of prisons, but still OSHA doesn't apply necessarily. And incarcerated workers are employed at obviously dangerous meat, poultry, and egg processing plants. We documented injuries and amputations from sewing and cutting machines and garment factories where incarcerated workers are employed. Cases of many incarcerated workers severely injured and paralyzed and even killed while cutting down trees, while working on community work crews and forestry jobs. And I want to emphasize even the maintenance work, that work in prison conditions in prison kitchens and laundries can be inherently dangerous because these are industrial scale prison kitchens and laundries. You can see here a picture of a worker in a kitchen. These are huge machines, and we documented really ghastly injuries in kitchens and especially laundries, or these huge laundry carts and crushed workers. Workers are also exposed to dangerous toxins on the job, especially when they're tasked with working in electronics recycling or other recycling type of jobs, lead and asbestos abatement, and other types of dangerous work. And 64% of the workers that we surveyed said that they felt concerned, worried for their safety while working. And we found that many of these injuries are preventable. In California, for instance, more than 600 injuries are reported by incarcerated workers over a 4-year period, including lacerations, amputations, and many of these cases, these injuries could have been prevented with proper training or machine guarding mechanisms or personal protective equipment. I mean, we cite many of these cases in the report, but one worker was tasked with wading into sewage and asked for protection and was told he was shit out of luck and he contracted hepatitis. Numerous cases of workers who were asked for protection and were just simply denied it. One example is, one difference too is that incarcerated workers don't get training on the job. So the one substantial difference is it's not someone who's worked as a forestry worker for years who's gotten adequate training. This is an incarcerated worker who for the first time is seeing a chainsaw and being tasked with cutting down a tree. We can document a case, for instance, of a man was rendered quadriplegic when he didn't want to cut down a tree, he was scared to do it. It was his first time seeing a chainsaw, and the corrections officer said, well, if you don't do it, you're going to solitary, you're not gonna be able to call home. And he did it and was severely injured by a falling tree. And as I mentioned, workers don't receive adequate training at all on how to handle hazardous chemicals, handling dangerous equipment. They're denied basic protections, and it results in really serious injuries. I'm going to very briefly talk about prison labor during COVID-19. Because prison industries programs are effectively factories in each of these prisons. And as I mentioned, every state but Alaska has these programs that during the very initial days of COVID-19, when we were all in lockdown, sheltering in place, incarcerated workers were forced to work in the pandemic, the first response to the pandemic. Nearly every state used incarcerated workers in their pandemic response. At least 40 states, their prison industries programs immediately switched to manufacturing PPE and hand sanitizer. Incarcerated workers were denied access, being able to use even the very masks they were producing. And this is a time when COVID was ripping through prisons. Incarcerated workers worked in morgues, transported dead bodies, dug mass graves, built coffins. They washed soiled hospital laundry, disinfected supplies, and cleaned medical units. They were really exposed at high levels to COVID. And in every state, incarcerated workers whose jobs are considered essential also continued to work during the lockdowns, which included manufacturing and agriculture and firefighting and meat processing. But at the same time, they were excluded from the essential worker vaccine rollout initially and weren't vaccinated until later, which led to tremendous loss and death of incarcerated people. Very quickly, since I know I'm running out of time, the other thing we found is that many of the jobs that incarcerated people are tasked with don't provide transferable skills and real vocational training that can help them to get work after prison. More than 70% of incarcerated workers rank skills learning as an important reason to be working, but in the reality, the vast majority of these programs don't offer that. This photo here is of incarcerated workers who are sweeping up horse dung after a public parade, for instance. And in fact, vocational training programs are declining in prisons across the country, and even those that exist often don't meet their full potential. Incarcerated workers report that many of these programs involve training on outdated equipment that's no longer used outside of prisons, or that provide work in areas of work that are projected to decrease in the job market, like farming and garment manufacturing. And so I'll just very briefly cover our recommendations for what to do about this, what would be a path forward, and then what's happening. Number one, end forced labor without exception. Repeal the state and federal constitutional exception clauses that allow for slavery and involuntary servitude to be used as punishment for criminal conviction, but also go beyond that. Ensure that all work is fully voluntary by eliminating any of the laws and policies that punish people or impose adverse consequences if they are unwilling or unable to work. And ensure that when people seek exemptions from work duties, that they're granted them if they're sick or have a disability or have other limitations. Guarantee workers all the standard labor protections. Treat incarcerated workers the same, as to the extent possible, as non-incarcerated workers. Give them all the same protections, and that includes minimum wage, overtime pay, same health and safety standards, right to unionize, so incarcerated workers can mobilize and demand improvement for their own working conditions, and protection from discrimination. Raise their wages, as I mentioned, to no less than minimum wage. And some research by economists shows that this can actually, though it will objectively cost money, that it will also save money, in that the wages can be, there will be savings because these wages can be taxed. Workers can earn into public benefits like Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, so people can earn into and ultimately receive future benefits for their many years of labor, often many years of labor while incarcerated, and limiting wage deductions as well. But this can ultimately generate more, or they will save money in this. There are fiscal arguments for increasing wages that includes the ability to pay back state victim restitution and court-ordered fines and fees, as well as child support, supporting families, and it can also substantially benefit the family members and loved ones of incarcerated people, protect them from workers from injuries and hazards, and that includes extending OSHA and state health and safety protections to incarcerated workers, and provide them with marketable skills and training, and eliminate barriers to securing employment after release. In terms of what's happening to change all of this, there's been a lot in the last few years. There have been real efforts led by organizations led by formerly incarcerated advocates and the Abolish Slavery National Network, which is a network of organizations throughout in states around the country that have been pushing to achieve constitutional reform at the state level. And voters in 8 states in recent years have passed constitutional amendments to ban slavery without exception. This means more than half of voters came across party aisles to say that there's no place for slavery in the United States today. And most recently in 2024, voters in Nevada passed a constitutional amendment that's preceded by Alabama, Oregon, Tennessee, Vermont, Nebraska, and Utah, and Colorado was the first state to do this in 2018. And unfortunately, in 2024, the legislature of California passed a bill that brought about measure to voters that almost passed. It received 46.66% of voters voted in favor of it, needed to achieve more than half. But advocates will be pursuing this in the next election cycle and midterms. And there are active campaigns by the Abolish Slavery National Network in at least 12 other states. There's also a federal bill that's introduced every year, the Abolition Amendment to amend the 13th Amendment. And Senator Booker in Congress introduced a package of 4 bills to end unfair abusive labor practices in prisons that would strengthen civil rights protections, ensure that the federal minimum wage and health and safety laws and anti-discrimination laws apply to incarcerated workers. And those have yet to be voted on, but there was a hearing on this that I testified in, and sort of the long-term project of educating members of Congress about this. And similar bills were introduced, identical bills were introduced in the House as well. And there have been efforts in the states as well. In New York, there's been legislative advocacy efforts by the 13th Forward Coalition, which includes the New York Civil Liberties Union, that would set a 3-hour minimum wage and basic labor protections and end forced labor, but it hasn't yet passed. Came really close during last legislative session. And there's success in Nevada, where the state legislature passed a bill capping deductions at 50%, which had previously been 80%. So 80% of incarcerated workers' wages were taken away, and now it's half. It's slightly better. And if you're interested in taking action, we have at aclu.org is the report, but there's an action here to send a letter or a letter to your member of Congress to support the Abolition Amendment. We update this when the Abolition Amendment changes, so you can sign up there. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to open for questions.
That was
Sorry.
great. No, that was super, super good. It's a breath of fresh air to see Nevada went with how they did as far as the voting. I mean, from 80 to 50, it's still a long way to go, but I mean, it's 30%. That's tremendous. That's great.
They passed a constitutional amendment, so.
Oh, that's huge. Yeah, that's awesome. Very, very awesome. All right, let me share. And if people, the people joining us, if there is additional questions, you could drop them in the chat. You could direct message either myself, Kim, or Jen, and we could take it from there. And then we can, if there is additional questions after that, we can settle up at the end as well. Let me share my screen for Kim here. Any way we can get copies of the slideshow? Yes.
Yeah, I'll show PowerPoint, and I actually included extra pages with just the photos and infographics. If you want to just pull those and use them however you see fit, but you're welcome to use it however you want.
Let me see here. Okay, Kim, let me see. You want to start with your slides as well? I can't, you gotta go off mute.
Hi, everyone. So I just, when they asked me about presenting about a week and a half ago, I worked with the older little 2024 version of Jennifer's PowerPoint. And I added some videos from YouTube. Two of the videos I have actually posted in the chat about how this very much has been in the news. And I created a graphic organizer to go along with it and a collection of current event supplemental readings that the Eastern State Penitentiary will share with you so that you could use this as instruction and do like a jigsaw reading with the students. But what I thought was, and since I always feel this comes back from my training through the National Constitution Center, the question of constitutional questions versus political questions. And the Constitution Center always says you should always start with the Constitution first, and then you build off from there. So what I developed was on an introduction activity, having the students work with the 13th Amendment and looking at the wording and where the loophole is. And so I found a good video that kind of introduces, it's in the Word document. I think it's the 13th Amendment introduction activity. It's an introduction video about the 13th Amendment and the loophole that's short, but kind of gets the kids interested. And then you look at the actual wording, and the 13th Amendment isn't very long, but it's interesting to look at where the loophole is. And then the National Constitution Center, for all parts of the Constitution, they have 3 essays that are written. One is what's the agreed upon common interpretation, and then the different matters of interpretation or debate. And they have usually a more conservative constitutional scholar writing one of the essays, and then a more liberal scholar writing the other. And so what I pulled from their website was the common interpretation, which talks about the intent for the 13th Amendment and why they designed it, but then also the loophole and what has happened with prison labor because of the loophole. And it references Supreme Court cases and other acts along the way. So I thought that would be important if you're going to be doing instruction with this for the students. Okay, well, let's go to the 13th Amendment. What was the intention of the drafters of the 13th Amendment? Why did they include this loophole? And then what has happened because of that? And use that as a starting point. And this activity would be a really great lead-in to Jennifer's PowerPoint, looking at the history of prison labor up through the present. And then the supplemental readings, you could jigsaw with the students and have them doing the reading, coming together to share and discuss in groups to add to the graphic organizer. And also, when I was thinking about this, I was also thinking as a social studies teacher, what are also the skills that are part of the discipline we want the students working with? So working with primary documents, working with secondary sources, but that are looking at through a historical thinking lens. Then how does this tie into use of current events and other resources beyond like the textbook? So that's where I developed for the supplemental reading. And then after that, I developed 2 other learning assessments you could do with the students. One is a podcast one, and so I teach AP US government politics, and I also teach honors government and academic A government. So I teach all the levels at my school with the study of government from the highest level to the lowest. And so I have been really using podcasts much more so this year as an instructional tool for a few reasons. One, podcasts that are coming out on Apple Podcasts are addressing things that are very much happening now in the present. So it's easier for the kids to stay current than with textbooks. Two, the students, they listen to podcasts. They're much more auditory listeners and processing of information. So it's kind of tying into ways that they already process and follow things around the world. And then also Apple Podcast provides transcripts for all of the podcasts. So for students, they can be listening to the podcast while also reading the transcript, which also helps kids with learning disabilities or L students. And so what I did a research and I found a collection of podcasts, some shorter ones, and then some longer ones that are more scholarly. And I kind of broke down what I would use for like my academic A or an unleveled elective versus for an honors and AP. And what I've developed was when I have the students listen to the podcast, I created a graphic organizer where they have to identify what are the main arguments of the podcast with supportive evidence. Actually, it's still part of that, Brian, if you would just scroll down. So there's actually lots of choices. So I know sometimes teachers don't have time to do the research. So I did a lot of the research for you so you can pick and choose. But I developed a graphic organizer where the students have to identify what are the main themes within the podcast and supportive details, but then also begin to think more critically, like considering bias. Some of the podcasts are done by activist groups, or they're interviewing, more liberal politicians. So one of the things I teach as a social studies teacher is I always teach my students that there's always bias whenever you're reading. So how do you recognize the bias? And how does that bias perhaps affect what's being presented? So that's something I start off doing right away with my AP and my honor students. For my academic A students, it's something that I've kind of added on as we work through podcasts through the year. And then what did they think are the 2 most important quotes from the podcast, 2 connections they can make to what we're learning, and then application, like what call to action do they think students or Americans should make about prison labor after learning about this? And then I always have like concluding analysis questions that tie in with what we're learning in class with the podcast, but also having the students think about this as a citizen and a future voter, having them begin to form their own opinions on this issue and think of the connections. So this is a type of learning assessment that if I was doing this with my students, I would have them doing this as a follow-up to Jen's PowerPoint with the graphic organizer and the jigsaw reading. And again, it's having the students extend what they're learning further and using different types of resources. And then what I developed as a possible culminating activity for the unit is a political cartoon learning assessment. If you could open that, Ryan. So you would think that prison labor and how controversial it is, that there'd be actually a lot of political cartoons about it. And I researched for like a day and a half, and I only could find 3 political cartoons on the topic, which was quite shocking to me, as you know, as a social studies teacher and also working with Eastern State. But so I found the 3 and I included them. And so what I do with my students is when I have them do political cartoon analysis, I have them use the format called optics, which is how you have them examine the cartoon through different parts. And so I have the political cartoons above, and then I have the optics analysis that the students would do. So I would assign each of the students one of the 3 different political cartoons to work with, and then complete the optics analysis. If you can kind of scroll down a little bit more for me, Ryan. So it's like the optics stands for overview, parts of the picture, examining the title, images and interrelationship, and then conclusion. And then I add for the S, what are the strategies? I think it's important to teach the students propaganda strategies, rhetoric strategies, and political cartoon strategies for them to be educated citizens and voters and consumers of the media. So in the beginning of the year, I teach them about different political cartoon strategies, and then they begin to recognize and analyze them as they work with political cartoons. And then the last 2 parts are, sorry, the other ones are just examples I meant to delete from, but what aspects of penal labor is addressed in the your assigned political cartoon, and how is it represented and why, and tying into what they learned from the podcast, the PowerPoint videos, the supplemental readings. And then based upon what you've learned about this, do you agree with the cartoonist? Explain why or why not. And again, using evidence to explore their opinion and their position. So this was something I developed that could be done as a concluding activity. And I also thought you could also take it a step further. Since there weren't many political cartoons out there on prison labor, you could have the students take it a step further where they could do this individually or work in groups collaboratively to create an original political cartoon. And you could even make it focused on the current debate and controversy about California using incarcerated firefighters, which has very much been in the news in the last year. And then have the students design and create their own political cartoon about prison labor. And whenever I have them do that, I always have them do the art part, but then also a writing part where they explain why they chose the topic and how they present as they did, how they use the different political cartoon strategies, and what they want the viewer to walk away with thinking about. And I thought that this would be a great another extension you could have the kids do, depending upon, especially if you have kids who are really creative and like to draw, taking art classes, as a further culminating project. There's so much out there. There's so much how it's been very much in the news because of California, the firefighters. Like CBS did a recent in March, on March 9th, they did a whole segment about prison labor and the invisible workforce. The Associated Press did a 2-year study about it and then released it in 2024. So it's very much more coming into the news and people becoming more aware, especially with Prop 6, which didn't pass in California, but how that was being proposed. That was very much in the news, and there was a lot about Prop 6 and the whole debate. So there's a lot of avenues you can go using current events where you could have the students explore it further and at different levels, and doing research projects and presentations on. So unfortunately, it's something that's really most people don't know about. that isn't addressed in schools. And it's only recently come to light. And it's important with the work like what Jennifer Turner's been doing with the ACLU to educate Americans. And for us as educators to say, okay, how can I integrate this into my curriculum, whether it's in a criminal justice like elective, whether it's in a government class or American history, and you're looking at like the Reconstruction or the civil rights and looking at current issues, or looking at literature that you're using in English. There's a lot of avenues that can be explored. Um, and I think it's something that teachers need to feel empowered to do. And hopefully these are just some ideas and starting points that can be used. So that was what I had planned. I don't know if there's any questions or for me or for Jen.
So what we can do, I'm gonna, okay, I gotta check if I'm unmuted. I'm gonna put my information in the chat here. If anybody, I know Andrea Krieg was asking about slides and additional information that was presented from you, Kim, and Jen as well. I know Jen dropped her her email in the chat over here. I'm just gonna add mine.
And then if anyone wants to email me, I will gladly share what I created.
So yeah, we can. I have. Do you want me to use the copies that I have?
Yeah, I'm going to revise the political cartoon because I realized I didn't take out from the previous assignment where I had done with the students on gerrymandering. So I'll update that and I'll email that to you.
Okay. Please. So I'll say it like this. If anybody wants copies of of the slideshows, any of the information that was presented on by both Jennifer and Kim, as you just heard, Kim's going to revise some of the images or the documents that was sent to me. You can email me or you can reach out to this, and we can send copies and forward copies to everybody that's on this call. In addition, let me put this in the chat as well. Let me look for it. We do have the Teacher Institute coming up again this year. It's going to be 2 this year, 1 in June, and then 1 in August as well. If you have interest in that, please go on www.easternstate.org and just with events coming up. This year it's pretty special because we have 2 cohorts. We haven't done that in the 3 years. This is going to be the 3rd year that this has taken place. The first 2 years was only single cohorts, so this is double this year. And it's an extended. It used to be 4 days a week. Now it's going to 5 days a week. And it's pretty, I mean, it's been life-changing for me. May I have information? Yes. Okay. Quick question. And if anybody has questions for Kim or Jennifer, you can take yourself off mute, or if you want to put it in the chat, you can do that as well. So confirm it. It is only, okay, so this is, I'm answering a question from Andrea. The cohort is currently, and maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, but it is only from K through 12 currently. They are working on additional development when it comes to, I'm going to say college professors. But I'm not at liberty to really like go into details about any of that. I know they are moving in the right direction because there is a lot of interest of bringing this into college classrooms. A lot like what was Kim was talking about, where it's not taught about in classrooms. It's not really students or facilitators don't know to teach about certain type of stuff. So there is an idea around that being built in. Kim Walker, other Kim, also a great person. Yeah, I will forward you everything presented here today straight to your email. I heard that I didn't know if there was progress. No, so if you heard this before with the progress when it comes to the cohort, it's probably coming from me. That was information that was shared with me this year. If there is new information, I will forward it to you. I do have your email still as well. I don't know who. I thought somebody came off mute. Clearly level on this. Well, I want to say thank you again. Thank you, Kim, for coming on and doing this presentation. Thank you always, Miss Jen Turner. You both are great people doing a lot of great work. I think it kind of just falls by the wayside sometimes just because of how life is, unfortunately. But without people like you, we wouldn't be as far as we are as a society, especially around these issues, especially when it comes to prison labor and use a political cartoon idea. Yeah. Especially around the prison labor aspect of it. From a consumer standpoint, from a country, from a neighborhood, from a society, it's if you're not directly impacted by this, you're indirectly impacted by this. So even though it seems like it's specific to one person's issue, it's a bigger issue than a lot of us want to admit or care to realize. We'll update and also include me about how you have developed Senator Ryan. Gotcha. Okay.
And then Ryan, I think Kimberly Walker asked, can you do the cohort again since they're doing it a bit differently this year? So since she did it last year, but this year, you know, you're gonna be working with the guys from the senior citizens in the senior citizen center from the prison. Can like people like Kim reapply and do it again, or is it a one-time deal?
I will reach out to you, Kim, when I'm in the office tomorrow to give you an update with that. Why is this? Let me see. Oh, here we go.
Sylvia, what does your prison museum have that would be awesome to like tie in with?
So right now, I just started about a year and a half ago. We're opening up more buildings. So I'm working on reinterpreting the site because it was more guard focused before I got here. So looking to add, like we have a firehouse. Yeah, you guys were discussing the prison firefighters and everything in California. I was just thinking like that would be awesome, but it is way like that in there. So I'm actually collecting artifacts as I'm going through the buildings. I'm a museum anthropologist. So just reinterpreting the site, trying to learn more, trying to incorporate other prison history. And I'm also doing oral history interviews with women's staff, which were usually not guards. So they worked in like administration or under a warden or somebody, and also inmates.
That's awesome. Have you reached out to teachers and your social studies teachers in the area, kind of like Eastern State has done, to help you develop like educational resources as you're developing the new exhibits?
I have not, but I would love to. I've talked to one criminal justice um, professor here at Joliet Community College, but I just hooked up with a civics professor at Elgin Community College. So I'm hoping to try out my new tour with him on mass incarceration. So
very awesome. I don't know if you're able to see the chat. It says this is from Andrea Krieg. It says Sylvia, I'm in Elmhurst and bring students there. We do field trips to the prison. It's great. I've got all your Sylvia, I've got all your Chicagoland CJ facility faculty hookups. I don't know what that means, but I mean, people are obviously a fan of the work you're doing over there, and they visited the site as well. So this is great. All right. With that being said, I will make sure everybody has copies of this. Is there any last words? Anybody wants to say anything before we cut this off for the day? Let me see.
And Sylvia and Andrea, if you have anything you want to share or if you want to run by, you have my email. I'm more than welcome to help. I work with the Justice 101 Collaboratory with the Eastern State Penitentiary Museum that their Curry started. So she has about 35 teachers and professors working to develop the educational resources through the museum. So if you want to reach out, then I can always see to hook you up to see how they were able to, how Curry was able to develop and build that program.
And feel free to reach out to me as well. And I emailed Ryan the PowerPoint, and feel free to reach out to me directly. I can share the PowerPoint, but you're welcome to use any or all of it, however is useful.
I just dropped 2 links in the chat as well. One's a survey just trying to figure out where everybody's hearing about these webinars from. And then also the second link is from the Teacher Institute that's coming up this year. Again, I will get back to Kim Walker tomorrow about reapplying and whatnot. And then additionally with Sylvia when it comes to the higher learning aspect of it. But I want to say thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody that take your time out to do this today, to the viewers, to our participants, to the facilitators. I appreciate you. I hope we can cross paths. I'll see Kim on Saturday. I hope we can cross paths in the future, Jen, as well. And good luck for everything that's happening on Saturday for you as well.
Right.
That's it.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody. And I'll make sure everybody has copies of this work going out. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the week.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.